Renew the debate on the item. I would now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Peru.
Mr. President, Peru aligns itself with the statement made by St. Vincent and the Grenadines, representing the community of Latin American Caribbean states, and by Azerbaijan on behalf of the non-aligned movement, and that made by Uganda representing the Group of 77 and China. And we welcome the presence of the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Cuba, Bruno Rodriguez Parilla. Each year, this General Assembly reiterates its firm position on the need to end the economic, commercial, and financial embargo imposed against Cuba. Last year, 185 countries, almost all member states of this organization, expressed the strongest possible support for lifting the embargo. This result reflects the collective and legitimate will, which is in line with the basic norms of international law of the General Assembly. At the same time, it was a clear and evident signal that it's necessary to put an end to this type of unilateral measure so that Cuba can advance on the path of development, meeting the Sustainable Development Goals of the 2030 Agenda. Mr. President, from the most recent report of the Secretary General, I would like to highlight the response provided by the Office of the United Nations High Commissioner of Human Rights. He concludes that the economic, commercial, and financial embargo imposed on Cuba continues to negatively impact the enjoyment of human rights by the country's population, particularly the most vulnerable people, and reiterates that when unilateral sanctions are directed against an entire country or entire economic sectors, it is the most vulnerable people in that country, the least protected, who will probably be most harmed. It also specifies that the population of those countries are in no way responsible for the policies that are the target of those sanctions, and to a greater or lesser extent have already been living in a precarious situation for a long time and are not responsible for that. Also, the Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights gives examples that illustrate how the embargo particularly affects the rights to health, adequate nutrition, adequate education of the Cuban people. Mr. President, Peru does not agree with the imposition of unilateral sanctions of any kind. The only legitimate sanctions are those adopted by the Security Council in the context of the exercise of its powers for the maintenance of international peace and security, in accordance with Chapter 7 of the Charter. And even in those cases, such sanctions are clearly delimited. For example, a couple of weeks ago, the Security Council unanimously approved Resolution 2700, renewing the sanctions regime against Haiti. In its preamble, it specified once again that the measures imposed by this resolution are not intended to have adverse humanitarian consequences for the civilian population, and that their relevance will be examined on an ongoing basis. The unanimous adoption reflects that for all members of the Security Council, including its permanent members, it's important to consider the adverse humanitarian consequences for the civilian population. That should be a consideration that applies in the case of every state without any distinction. In the context of the multiple crises that we are experiencing, any action that affects directly people's living conditions generates consequences on various levels, and its impact can be structural, multidimensional, cross-cutting, or can be a multiplier of underlying causes. Therefore, any measure that has adverse humanitarian consequences for the population of any state or any nation must be eliminated or suspended immediately. Mr. President, Peru shares the view of practically the entire international community in considering that the embargo on Cuba is against the principles and purposes of the United Nations Charter, as well as against international human rights covenants. Consequently, Peru once again expresses that it will vote in favor of the draft resolution entitled "The Necessity of Ending the Economic, Commercial, and Financial Embargo Imposed by the United States of America against Cuba as part of a state policy that we have followed without interruption for more than 30 years." Thank you very much.